Welcome everybody to the virtual National Roundtable, Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women in the Context of COVID-19. This is the first of a series of virtual roundtables centered on leveraging the conversations and practices that interact with gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada. We're going to start with the land acknowledgement. This presentation is being hosted on the traditional territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. Takaranto, also known as Toronto, is now home to many Indigenous peoples, including the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples.
Hello, can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, this is Deepa from Schleifer. I've been trying to access this for last 10 minutes. I am in a different webinar. Sorry.
Thank you, Deepa. Sorry for the confusion. You are now connected. I'm just going to do a quick introduction and then we'll carry on with the program.
Okay, awesome.
So first of all, we want to start by saying thank you to everyone who's joining us today. We're heartened by the number of people who registered, with over 400 across Canada. My name is Margarita Pinton-Perez, and I'm the Senior Coordinator of the Initiative to End Gender-Based Violence at Advocacy, the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants. I will be the moderator for today's roundtable. The full potential of this roundtable, the active learning process, is only really realized when we can connect with various participants at different levels. We have speakers, attendees. All that we're asking is that you please contribute. We hope that attendees that are online, that are listening to us now, will be able to participate in online polls and feedback surveys that will be shared throughout this broadcast. You will be prompted to respond to these polls and you will see results in real time. As part of today's roundtable, we have also invited a group from Brilliance Mastery to create a digital visual summary of our discussions. This will serve as a visual artifact, so something that we'll be able to share with you shortly, and it'll be a useful tool to help us keep this dialogue going with one another, with our partners, and in our communities. That being said, it's important to acknowledge the virtual reality that we're in right now, and what that can entail. We may need your forbearance with some technical issues. Hours before we started this virtual roundtable, we had also confronted a few technical issues, but it seems that we're resolved. If you have any issues during this virtual roundtable, we ask that you please email Sophil. This is the email here, the following address. Also, please note that if you're having any technical issues, you can please write to us in the chat. We have people from the Advocacy team who are on the lookout to respond and to see if anybody's having technical issues or if they have any questions. We want to begin by saying that these conversations have always been urgent, but it's during this time that we're seeing how this urgency is emergent and intensified. This speaks to the recognized emergency of these unprecedented times. We're introducing this virtual roundtable as a place to host conversations and exchanges that consider the differential impacts of COVID-19 among non-status refugee and immigrant women. Perhaps like you, we've been attending, and myself, we've been attending many teach-ins, webinars, virtual sessions. There's a lot of information that's circulating and a lot of virtual community building that's being fostered and facilitated right now as we speak. At the same time, there can be a lot of information fatigue. This roundtable was organized by a group of community partners and agencies across Canada, part of a national project funded by Women and Gender Equality Canada called Building Leadership Capacity to Address Gender-Based Violence Against Non-Status Refugee and Immigrant Women Across Canada. Something our project works towards is developing relationships and hosting space for conversations, this kind of messy thinking that can arise in efforts to support and center and build the capacity among non-status refugee and immigrant women in the planning and design of supports and services. I want to do a shout out to all of the members of this group who have worked very hard to develop this roundtable series. This also gestures, and our work with this project gestures to the historical and important social movement and consciousness raising work of racialized immigrant groups across the globe, who have paved the way, are making space for relationship building and developing community-based responses to gender-based violence. This roundtable today brings together community organizers, frontline workers, academics, and organizational leaders to share their insights, assessments, and experiences around the unique tensions and challenges COVID-19 signifies when we're thinking about gender-based violence against non-status, refugee, and immigrant women. Today's roundtable is not about leading a conversation, but leveraging and hosting these conversations. As the COVID-19 situation continues to evolve, we learn that this further gender inequalities and increases risks of gender-based violence. What does this mean for non-status refugee and immigrant women across Canada? And how can we better respond to GBV against non-status refugee and immigrant women in the context of COVID-19? The objectives of today and this roundtable are to share resources, to share thinking, strategies, to learn to further support the efforts to address gender-based violence against non-status refugee women in this context of COVID-19 and beyond, and to identify some priority issues, areas for action, and immediate topics for further collective discussion. I will stop taking up airtime because our first speaker is Debbie Douglas, who will have to attend another meeting after this, a very important meeting. So I'd like to now introduce Debbie Douglas, the Executive Director of the Ontario Council of Agencies Serving Immigrants, who will be able to provide us with more of a national overview and context of the differential, oh, I just missed it. There we go. So Debbie, if you would like to take over, I believe your microphone is unmuted. Let me confirm.
Thank you, Margarita. Yes, it is. Thank you. Great. Thank you for inviting me to start. I apologize in advance, and I won't take up a lot of time. I just wanted to say a welcome from Advocacy and just to talk very briefly with you about some of the things that are happening nationally. I'm sure many of you on the call know of many of these issues, and my apologies because I'll have to duck out right after I finish speaking. I'm hoping to get back before the end of the conversations. However, I just wanted to talk about how important it is for us to, as we do this work and as we participate in various conversations about COVID-19 and the responses and its impact on gender-based violence as it has to do with non-status immigrant and refugee women, to remind ourselves that we must come to this from an intersectional way of framing the conversation. We know historically and currently that different groups of women have different experiences with GBV, but also in terms of how they experience things like this pandemic. One of the things that we've been paying attention to as we have been at the various tables is to speak about how many of the government responses in terms of income security, so everything from the CERB to EI to the Enhanced Canada Child Benefit programs are not easily accessible by all women and are certainly not accessible in the same way. And so while the majority of immigrant and refugee women, those who are experiencing violence and not, are able to access it, non-status women with Canadian-born children are not, for example, able to access the CCB or any of the other income supports that's been put in place. We have been having various conversations, especially across the country, with women who are non-status, who work in the service industry, whether or not they're cleaning offices or they're working in the sex trade, but primarily in the informal economy. And now that they're unable to work, with all of the things that have been putting in place, both at the federal levels and across the various provinces and territories, non-status women have no access. So it means that they're not able to access, including government social assistance. We believe that there is a court case here waiting to happen in terms of issues of equity. But currently at this time, they are not able to access it. So when we hear the framing of COVID, the COVID virus and its responses, everything from issues of staying home, Well, we have to interrogate what that means for many people. We know, for example, that many immigrant and refugee families, particularly refugee and non-status family, are living in with housing insecurity. Many don't have homes and are in refugee shelters, for example, or in GBV shelters. We're hearing from shelters across the country that they're facing a bottleneck as they're trying to do distance, that folks who may be able to acquire housing, non-status women aren't able to because they have no access to income. And so they're not being able to move out of the shelter. So that increases their probability of contracting the virus. We continue to hear of women in particular provinces where police have been given increased powers to stop and ID folks, that women with precarious immigration status, especially those who are undocumented, are not leaving home. So they're not isolating only because of the virus, but they're isolating because of the fear. Even in terms of accessing food at the various food banks, they're afraid of being stopped and carded and being reported to CBSA, which is the Canada Border Service Agency, and then although the government is no longer detaining people based on immigration, is what we've been pushing for and what they've said they've committed to, that they will now be flagged to CBSA and face potential deportation post-pandemic. So there are a number of issues that we have to pay attention to as we think through the work that we're doing around gender-based violence, the pandemic, and some of the responses that we've been seeing to it. There are a number of national women's movements overlapping in terms of who has been engaged. That's been meeting and chatting to each other pre-pandemic, but certainly in the last few weeks as this pandemic has been rolling out. And the conversations, and at those tables, we ensure that we're centering the experiences of non-status refugee and immigrant women. Not always easy to do because we're constantly having to pay attention. It doesn't come naturally, unfortunately, to mainstream organizations when it is that they're putting forward a women's agenda that in 2020 we should not be generalizing about women's experiences. We know that women, based on identity, be it immigration status, be it race, be it issues of gender and gender identity or sexual characteristics, are having a differential experience with what is happening now. And so what we've been saying to the government is that in your responses, you must pay attention to who is the most vulnerable among us. So, and what we're saying is that women who are experiencing violence, women who are experiencing violence without legal immigration status, women who are newly arrived and are refugees, poor women, are all having, women living with disabilities, are all the populations that we need to be paying attention to ensure that all government responses, so everything from income supports to social assistance to the kinds of supports that's being given to the sector, and I'll conclude with the sector, must be responsive to the most vulnerable amongst us. We know that the federal government over the last couple of weeks have announced a number of initiatives to support the women's serving sector. They announced 27 million, I believe, that's being distributed through Shelters Canada, another $4.5 million to sexual assault centers that's being distributed through the Canadian Women's Foundation. And last week, on a call with the Minister Monsef, we also heard that there was a $10 million contingency fund, and we really impressed upon the minister the importance of ensuring that those dollars reach women's centers, women's centers that are working with immigrant and refugee women, women's centers that are working with non-status women, women's centers that are working with non-status women in the sex industry. Those are the women who are requiring support, not only service supports, but income support. And so we continue, and I think those of you on the call, part of our advocacy must be about centering non-status women, about centering immigrant and refugee women, and about centering racialized women. One of the things I wanted to say is that as we continue this work as a collective, and those of us who are not part of this initiative specifically, but who are working on the issue of gender-based violence, we must not only bring an immigration status analysis to the work, but we must bring a race analysis to this work. We know that racialized women are overrepresented in every statistics that they can think of. When we look at low income, when we look at issues of wages, when we look at issues of job security, and job precarity, when we look at issues of the child protection services, when we look at imprisonment, we know that racialized and Indigenous women are overrepresented in those numbers. And so in our responses, we must be specific. And that is why it's so important that we bring not only a gender analysis to these issues, but we bring a gender race plus analysis to this issue, plus being issues of disability and immigration status, and of course, economic class. So I will stop there. I'm hoping to be able to come back for some of the discussions later on, but I just need to step off for a minute. Thank you for Okasi for this opportunity.
Great, thank you so much, Debbie. Thank you so much for really emphasizing the kind of intersectional harms, the requirement to think about this in particular with a framework that considers gender, considers race, that considers class, that considers immigration status as well, as you mentioned. The next part of the roundtable is going to be providing us with more of an assessment and an overview of what's happening here, what we can call more of a local context, so the context being Toronto. In today's roundtable for this part of the session, we will have, we are going to have a few speakers, organizational leaders, community organizers that are going to speak to this. And we're starting first with Deepa Mattu, who is the Executive Director of the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic. And we're asking the following questions to all of the speakers for this part of the session, for them to provide us, please, with an assessment of what this, one moment, sorry. My screen is sharing and then not sharing here. So we're asking here, what's the assessment of this unprecedented crisis, and what does it implicate for non-status refugee and immigrant women? And how can we better understand and respond to gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women under the context of COVID-19? So without further ado, I'll let Deepa start, and I'll just ensure that her microphone is unmuted. Deepa, are you there?
Hi. Yeah, I'm here. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Margarita, and thank you to Okasi and Debbie for bringing us together on this Thursday afternoon. I am going to respond to these two questions in a flipped way. I'm going to first talk about how can we better understand to respond to non-status refugee and immigrant women, and then what is the assessment that of this unprecedented crisis. And I feel like these two conversations are so overlapping as well. So bear with me as I speak out my thoughts, and I try to organize it in a way where I can first talk about what the challenges are. I feel like Debbie kind of gave us a really good capture of what all variety of issues that are happening. I would like to approach it from the fact that any of the understanding or response around gender-based violence during COVID-19 has not been trauma-informed, and which means that it does not include voices of the people and the experiential expertise that people have. And when I say that, I say it with a lot of humbleness, because I know that fear, isolation, shifting borders, lack of access to services, all of this is not new to precarious and non-status migrant women. This is not their first time living through a lockdown, virtual or real lockdown reality. They know this, and they have lived through these, whether through the experience of being refugees and displacement, or being through the experience of being survivors of violence and living in the most harshest of circumstances at home, if they had a home. And I feel like there has been a huge, huge opportunity lost there for not including them and including their voices in these solutions that were being found and created. There was a complete lack of understanding that we have experts in this country, in the cities that we live in, who know how to do this, and they know how to do it actually better than anyone of us with the privileges that we carry with ourselves know. So that I feel like is one biggest starting point of thinking about the response, that we did not consult with them and we did not include their experiences or the voices. What is the assessment of how do we better respond? I think Debbie has given us a really great framework. We have to, right from public health to affordable housing to social assistance to labor rights to the education access, all of those factors, I think, needed to be thought about and included. We created the space for work from home, and who can work from home? We know that, like it's people like you and me, people who have a situation of being in a privilege of having access to technologies and phones and access to resources. If I was cleaning office without status, I don't think I can work from home because my job requires me to go and clean an office, and I cannot do it. And without status, I cannot step out of the house because now I'm fearful that I'll be carded, and probably be on a path of removal. Then we had all these things announced that, the access to health would happen. And then we had, there is no deputation really happening. But who really knows that? Who really knows that is who speaks English. Who really knows that is who has access to the resources. And of course, there's very little done. So I speak 4 or 5 different languages. I access a lot of ethno-specific media. And I can tell you from my own personal experience, I have never heard anyone on any of those ethno-specific channels talk about, even if you don't have a status, even if you don't have been in this country less than 3 months, you can actually access public health. I have not heard that. Things were done quickly in a way that they needed to respond to it, but there is no actually messaging that is being carried forward. And who is left to do that is non-status, people who work with non-status individuals, organizations which are not-for-profit and charitable like ourselves. And we are also in a mode of responding to the crisis because we lack resources. So those are some of the things that I feel like at the offset of this whole problem has happened. Now, so what could have happened or what can happen? I think in ordinary times when there is no pandemic, we look at sanctuary city models and state policies and the not-for-profit spaces as the places to relieve some of these burdens, right? So the burdens around how would, say, a woman get a space to live, how would, say, for example, get access to education while being without status, who can actually support her in health. So all of that is supposed to lie in these 3 moving pieces. Unfortunately, even the expanded experience of, say, a sanctuary city, which is like Toronto, is not necessarily coming without the hassles that it has during this pandemic time. And we all know that there has been a deficit in that model right from the beginning, and we have always been talking about that the access to fair in the sanctuary cities does not necessarily include the experience of women, and a woman needs access to housing and access to income security way more than she needs access to a swimming pool. But at this time, all those asks that we had been building upon or talking about, they get exposed even further because the non-cooperation model with the Federal Immigration Authority that we think is the key to the solution has still today not been solidified. And I think Debbie kind of already alluded to it in her opening. So what did we saw? We saw closure of public spaces. We saw reduced public transportation. We saw physical distancing. We saw targeted quarantine for specific populations. And all of that for non-status or precarious status communities is a big challenge to actually access to the basic needs and necessities of life. Now, in terms of their experience of serious, untreated physical and mental health crisis that they are going through, there is another huge layer of poverty, homelessness, their economic exploitation. So I think one of the things that is kind of shocking to see is that how many of live-in caregivers were told that they can actually not leave the house, and if they leave the house, they don't have a job to come back to. How many cases of interpersonal abuse went up through the roof for organizations which support non-status folks, because suddenly that little bit support structure which was available was gone. So along with all of that, I think Debbie's point is very, very important for us to remember that within the politics of the fear and within the politics of the discourse that we are in, that safety is paramount, but then suddenly it was my safety of my community, my space, rather than safety of the people who are most vulnerable. People who are most vulnerable were an afterthought, which is obviously a topic of a much bigger discourse. So we have seen a few things which are very important for us to remember. We have seen the closures of the border suddenly for the asylum seekers. We have seen racist characterization of this pandemic, and we have seen racist experiences of people from particular group. So we know that people have called COVID-19 as a Wuhan virus or a Chinese virus, and I hope some of you have been following the stories of how some of the women who are at the forefront of fighting this have experienced the worst kind of racist remarks or physical violence against them. So all of that within the realm of COVID-19 experience of violence, all of that needs to be taken into account in part of your assessment. Now comes the next point around what do we need to do? So as we start talking about recovery, as we start to talk about public health, as we start to talk about our democratic values, on that totem pole of all of those values and rights that we talk about, unfortunately, this population experiencing violence, unfortunately, suddenly gets to the bottom of the bottommost. Within the spaces where money has been released, a lot of that money has gone to specific kind of services, specific kind of spaces. And I'm not saying that, I'm not pitting ourselves against them, but thinking about how much of those resources were given out to racialized, migrant, non-status, precarious status women with experience of violence, you can actually count. There is no money. There is no resources put towards that. A lot of lip service happened, and a lot of assessment of that this should also benefit you. There is a politics of inclusion, but there is no explicit politics of this population needs protection and safety, and let's put resources behind that. So what is required? Do we require coordination? I think that goes without saying. Absolutely. We need coordination in the best of the times. We definitely need coordination at this time as well. And some of the things that can happen, one which I feel is really important to think about is, what are the economic, wherever non-status folks or precarious status folks were providing an economic role, why can social assistance access that has been created, why can't be tweaking done, and that social assistance can be actually available to folks who are providing economic benefit, but don't necessarily have incorporated businesses, not necessarily have any formal way of proving their status. So can those benefits just be given out to everyone? Can there be the shelters? Can shelters and the movement behind shelters and residences? Can there be a space created for people to have housing? So access to housing without status, so that some of those women who are in the need of getting support around housing and priority housing in particular, they can get to to that space. Some of the things that are really important in coordination and thinking about is things that are happening to our temporary foreign workers, things that are happening to our international students. None of the benefits, again, are coming to them. They are left in lurch. There is no support available to them. Their economic contribution is reduced to nothing during COVID-19. International students in particular, I want to say that they pay like 3 times, 4 times the regular fee, which is, of course, I understand because of many reasons. But thinking about that, suddenly they are left without any kind of safety net when they cannot do those jobs. And we know their reality. We know how many of them have heavy loans on their heads, and they have a lot of money to go back to the banks and the private lenders they have taken the money from. We also see something that I also want to talk about when it comes to the coordination is that when we talk about experiences and all of these things, I feel like the experiences in the bigger cities like Toronto is very different than the cities which are much smaller or have a very few resources. So the coordination and the knowledge that, and again, the privilege that places like ours are positioned to have, and those challenges are very different than the smaller cities and rural jurisdictions. We have to think about that, how much more we have here and how many more people we have here to come forward and support. So how do we coordinate some of that knowledge, some of that human mobility, of knowledge as well as resources that we can do among ourselves? Because reduction of public spaces in a bigger city as compared to a reduction of a public space or reduction of public transportation in a smaller city is a very different experience. And I think that needs to be kept in mind. I hope that kind of gives you some sense of my screaming in my head that happens quite a bit. And I am happy to join the conversation for the rest of the day.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Deepa. Thank you so much. And you actually went on, and as you were answering also the next questions around what's required of our work, our actions, our community responses. And I'm really grateful that you're also mentioning this piece about who's being consulted, and also the requirement to be also assertive after this as well, right? That we've seen some political will, but the requirement to continue to be assertive. We will have an opportunity, as you mentioned, to hear a little bit more about what's happening in other regions in the second part of this session today. So that's excellent as well. I'm glad you brought that up. Next up, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Mercy Law-Levy, from the Executive Director of the Immigrant Women's Services of Ottawa. Mercy, are you there?
Yes, I am, Margarita.
Excellent.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have
everyone hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Perfect. So, Margarita, I think I might go ahead and answer both questions. Would
Absolutely,
that be okay?
go for it.
Okay,
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
So I'll start with what's my assessment of this unprecedented crisis. So
Sure.
yes, these are truly unprecedented times, and we are dealing with a virus that, apart from illness and death, brings with it other collateral psychological injuries. We now frequently talk about lockdowns, self-isolation, quarantine, and with these come feelings of fear, loneliness, claustrophobia, uncertainty, and the fear of death. So yes, these are unprecedented times for all of us. But let's pause for a minute to focus on non-status refugee and immigrant women who live and work in our midst. How does all this affect them? How do we begin to understand all this in the context of their experiences of gender-based violence and before and during COVID-19? Now, to answer this question adequately, I'm going to shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
I would like to invite you to come along with me just for a minute to imagine in very general terms what life has been for non-status women and how this pandemic has compounded their challenges. I know that we all know the challenges that non-status women face. But I feel it's important to remind ourselves about these challenges in order to put things into perspective. And I recognize that non-status women are a diverse group and therefore have diverse experiences and needs. But for the purposes of this discussion, I will dwell on certain general trends that are unique to non-status women. So that being said, please join me to put ourselves in the shoes of a non-status woman and imagine the following. You came to Canada legally some years ago, having been sponsored by your partner, but the relationship became abusive and you had to flee before receiving your permanent residence. That's one scenario. Or you made a refugee claim here in Canada, which was rejected, and you could not go back to face an uncertain future or face injury. Or you came to Canada on a temporary resident permit, but for many reasons you overstayed your permit and consequently you became a person without status. So for people who are asking, yeah, these non-status women, blah, 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 just to put some of these facts into perspective. Now, in order to survive, as a non-status woman, you're forced to work under the table to avoid being noticed by authorities and consequently deported. You have very limited access to education, healthcare, housing, social services, and you're afraid to reach out to supports because you fear deportation. You have a job, yes, it's often cleaning, food production, or care work, and your employer takes advantage of your irregular immigration situation and pays you less than the minimum wage, and you have no recourse to the law. You are exposed to racism, discrimination, and harassment at the workplace, but you take it all in because you do not want to lose the job that keeps you afloat. In addition to all this, you feel excluded and isolated in many different ways. Now, imagine how vulnerable and unprotected you feel because you are afraid to call the police in an emergency for fear of putting yourself at risk of deportation. This little exercise is simply to put us in that frame of mind to really understand the non-status women. So all these challenges leave non-status women particularly vulnerable to gender-based violence in its many forms, and this only compounds their already difficult situation. Then comes along COVID-19 to compound the situation even further. The stay-at-home directive during this pandemic has increased instances of gender-based violence globally, and non-status women are not exempt. With the pandemic, non-status women began to face other new challenges that continue to impact their lives. Their level of anxiety is heightened because they do not have the right or sufficient information of what is actually going on as it relates to the pandemic, often due to language barrier or because they cannot access community services to provide them with accurate information and needed supports. For those non-status women working precarious jobs, many may have been laid off during this time and are stressed about how to meet their basic needs. Though having lost their only source of livelihood, it is important to note that they are not eligible for any of the recently announced government financial supports. Other non-status women who are still working during this pandemic may not have the option to stay at home, as they are working as cleaners or in food production, which are much needed at this time to keep everyone else safe and fed. Again, to note, most of them do not have access to paid sick leave. So living and working as a non-status woman is hard enough, as we have just seen, but the experience of gender-based violence coupled with dealing with COVID-19 and its consequences is pushing them to the brink of despair, and they need all the support that they can get. In terms of conditions that are further intensified, and what does this mean for responding to gender-based violence? COVID-19 has brought in its trail massive job losses, and some businesses may not recover. This means that situations of poverty are likely to intensify, and marginalized non-status women who often access low-income precarious jobs will be the most impacted. Not being able to pay rent or buy food for their children puts them at high risk of eviction and homelessness, not to mention put them in acute economic distress. With no income supports, conditions of dependency are created, leaving these women very vulnerable to violence. Secondly, mental health issues will likely be further intensified as non-status women, together with other members of the community, lose loved ones to COVID-19 and worry about their family members in other countries where health services and resources may not be as good or readily available. Such high levels of anxiety may cause severe emotional distress and more acute mental health issues. Thirdly, conditions of vulnerability are likely to intensify because of increased racism, discrimination, and xenophobia, which are already being reported during this period. The experience of this may push non-status women further into isolation, thus shifting their self-confidence and potential. All these factors, amongst many others, will contribute to make non-status women more vulnerable to gender-based violence, either in their homes, in their workplaces, or in public spaces. From all indications, reports coming to us indicate that instances of gender-based violence have increased during the pandemic, not only here in Canada, but globally. When responding to gender-based violence against non-status women, it is critical to understand their unique challenges and their perspectives of issues based on their lived experiences, and to recognize their strengths and their resilience. It is also important to apply an intersectional gender lens to consider the intersections of violence, race, gender, immigration status, and so on, and to recognize that each woman's safety and emotional needs vary, and one-size-fits-all approach will not work. It is our responsibility as advocates to ensure that the barriers that non-status women face are reduced and at best removed. We need to critically and continuously examine the conditions and policies that perpetuate their poverty and their inability to contribute fully to the economy and the social fabric of Canada. Our work has never been more important than it is today, amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, and we must work together in solidarity to continue pressing for positive change. It is important to stress that non-status women also contribute to the economy, without a doubt. As mentioned earlier, many, for example, are cleaners, farm hands, domestic workers, taking care of children and the elderly. And like everybody else, they have been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic. They have either lost their jobs or have had their hours reduced. Thus, with no income supports, they are unable to feed their families or pay their rent. Our work is to continue to advocate for income support for these women, regardless of their immigration status, and to push for systemic change, which will ensure access without fear. We have seen the devastating impact of the challenges they face, primarily because their immigration status precludes them from accessing much needed services. At this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, they need to be able to freely access health services and testing without fear of eventual deportation. This will be beneficial for everyone. Furthermore, we need to push for job protections for non-status women, and this includes fair wages, paid sick leave and other benefits, adequate protective gear as needed, especially during this pandemic, and that they are protected from workplace harassment and discrimination, amongst others. We need to collaborate collaboratively work together to continue raising these issues to effect positive systemic and social change for non-status women. I think that's about it. I don't want to go any further because we don't have that much time, but I think these are some of the things that I wanted to say on the topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Mercy, for that. And thank you so much for speaking to these larger kind of systemic structural forms of violence, but also really grounding us with and centering what those experiences look like in the everyday. And you really did highlight some of those unique challenges, the pieces around precarious status in particular, and access and those barriers that are there. So I'm really grateful for the way that you were able to share that information. Next, we're going to call on Cornelia, who is a member of the Rights of Non-Status Women's Network. Just want to make sure that she's connected.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
Great, excellent. Go ahead.
The Rights of Non-Status Women's Network is an organized grassroots collective of service providers, scholars, and individual community members in Toronto. And our mandate is to address barriers to services and resources faced by non-status women through coordinated public education, knowledge exchange, and advocacy for the purpose of systemic change. I think both of the previous speakers have made some excellent points in terms of individual, but also systemic approaches. We cannot provide or fight for a solution without a systemic view on these issues. In terms of the assessment, women with no status facing violence are trapped in this perfect storm of intersecting barriers, which have been escalating with the virus. Those barriers were there previously. However, with everything that's happening, everything is being exacerbated on so many different grounds. Non-status women are among the most exposed and the least protected. They prop up the essential service sector with their unrecognized, underpaid, and often dangerous jobs in cleaning, food production, and care work. And most, as Deepa was mentioning, don't have the option of working from home. Right. And while these jobs put non-status women among those who are protecting and caring for the rest of us, they do so with great precarity, as labor rights, decent working conditions, and minimum pay are often not respected. We have reports trickling in from farmers in terms of precarious work conditions, not having a protective gear, and being afraid to speak out against the employer for fear of losing their jobs or being reported to immigration. Despite their efforts, non-status women who lose their jobs or have to give them up to care for their children because schools are closed may not be eligible for government-issued financial supports. As we focus on social isolation to combat the virus, obviously a home is not necessarily always a safe place for women, and especially non-status women. It's again well recognized that this crisis has increased incidence of gender-based violence. Part of my work as a lawyer in criminal and immigration law, I work with clients who get arrested by the police, and I respond to the 1-800 number for people who don't have lawyers and get arrested or detained. And I think just during my shifts, about 75% of calls are domestic violence related. And it's not just the perpetrator that will get arrested. It often happens that the woman placing the call ends up the one being arrested, just because the perpetrator might actually have better language abilities and provide a better version of the story to the police. So there are many barriers that women face and that are exacerbated given all of the restrictions that are placed on the entire population of having to isolate at home. Non-status women experiencing abuse have limited access to information, counseling, health services, other social assistance or services, though there are agencies and shelters providing support. However, funding and other barriers such as language and fear will have an impact on the ability of accessing those services. Over-policing, it's a huge issue, as was already mentioned. There are additional powers that were given to provincial offense officers, including TTC and other transportation constables, community housing constables, public health officers, police, municipal bylaw officers, and City of Toronto online system for reporting non-compliance. For non-status women who are often racialized, surveillance by law enforcement can significantly increase stress and trauma, especially as many continue to work in informal sectors. So while this isolation and separation from family and friends has been difficult for everyone, we have to pause and reflect on the similar situation faced by thousands of women every day because of their immigration status. Non-status women are often excluded and isolated in many different ways, and there is no solution that will fit one person. Every person is different and might require different intervention. In terms of how we can better understand, because people are afraid to come forward, it's difficult to appreciate the magnitude of the phenomenon, although it is well documented that domestic violence has increased during the pandemic. That number must be even higher given the barriers that women face in coming forward to report or to access services. So it's a matter of listening better to the survivors who come forward trying to escape violence. And our response has to include, has to be uniform and has to be in terms of all of the agencies having the same agenda to push forward to receive the funding and the supports that they need to get this job done. People should have access to same people with no status, women with no status, to same social safety nets that people with status do, with the addition that they might need additional supports to deal with trauma and other issues that they might be facing in their own personal situation. I don't know if you want me to say something on the second question, or you want me to wait
Sure, we can wait because we'll come back and give everybody a minute or two afterwards to respond to the second question that has a little bit more to do with kind of what's required or what actions, kind of community responses. If you'd like, when we return to you, you can speak maybe a little bit to the statement that's come out recently from the network. And
Sure.
I appreciate, yeah, Cornelia, I really appreciate as well kind of the language you're giving some of this around the intersecting barriers, and the speaking really to those kinds of that kind of systemic approach that's required. And you also emphasize kind of the hyper surveillance of certain communities, of certain groups, that this has been with the policing. This has also been longstanding and an area that the network has also kind of been speaking to. So
Yes.
we'll be able to come back and speak a little bit more to the call to actions that people are seeing right now, a visual that corresponds to that statement that came out from the network.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we're going to speak to Sultana from the South Asian Women's Rights Organization. I believe, Sultana, you're on the call.
Hey, this is Sultana. Do you hear me?
I hear you. We hear you very well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks
So,
for giving us an opportunity to talk. May I start?
yes, please go ahead.
I'm very, very happy to join these things. And I already see Deepa, Mercy, and Cornelia already cover all of the things that the assessment is totally cover all the sectors. So it is good. But I just want to talk on behalf of our living experience, that to add something with these things, to see the assessment. Before we do go through this assessment, we would like to go a little bit back, pre-COVID-19 situation, that where was the systemic barrier we had before. So like we know from our 10 years work experience in this community, we find it out that gender-based violence for NSRI women, non-status refugee and immigrant women, have affected by two factors. One is the lack of independency, another one is lack of personal agency. And both factors are related with the lack of economic opportunity. And we found it like that when a vulnerable, marginalized, racialized immigrant women get a job or work and get economical freedom, they have their own agency in the house and they can minimize the violence in their family. So this strategy we are using, and recently we find it out that even though like we help the women previous this situation, COVID-19 situation, most of the women, those who are working in the frontline job, is the retail sector, fast food sector, precarious PSW job, all precarious immigration, precarious employment like manufacturing sector, all of the job, who did this kind of job? This job is done by this NSRI women, all the racialized immigrant women, non-status women, those who are doing this kind of job. I totally agree with Marcia that these non-status women, how they totally violated their right by the employer and how they get suppressed by the employer. They work less than minimum wage job and they also get super exploited. And the main thing is right now, they are hit very hardly by this COVID-19 because they don't have any proof that they work and they earn the money. They cannot access any kind of SAR benefit. They cannot access anything. So we find it out that women face two kinds of violence. One is staying home is a violence because these women, those who are right now staying in the home, is not that staying home on front of TV and see the TV. They have to do tons of work in the home. They have to take care of the children, senior, and sometimes do the all household work, cooking, and the house is not a good place for them because they're already subletting some of the space to the house, because this is the way poor people are living, giving their apartment to the other person to live. So like in a small apartment, 12 people are living. It's like a very chaos situation. And on the top of these things, when these women doesn't have any income, they don't have any voice. And when they are not entitled for any of this benefit and not money is not coming home, they find it out their male partner has the authority, and the violence is occur in the house. Most of the times, when you go to the Bangladeshi community, we find it out the divorce rate is so low. It doesn't mean that Bangladeshi man is very decent. It means that Bangladeshi women has lots of tolerance. They tolerate all of the things for their family, for their children. And this is the thing, they sacrifice their life. But this is sometimes when the violence escalated. Recently, it's happened, one of our members, they called the police separated them, but right now the woman has a huge issue, how she will going to pay her rent. Because we help the women to go for OW, and we find it out that she's only eligible for $1,000, but the rent is alone is more than $2,000. So these are the systemic issue that we had before the pandemic. And now this, because of this systemic issue exists in the society, inequality exists in the society. When the pandemic hit at us, this group of people hurt very strongly, and they don't have any sustainability to live in the society. Right now, I find it out that most of the women are forced to go outside to go the work, even though like they have a fear. Like World Health Organizations they put two kind of measurement. One is like you have to stay home and take care of yourself and health, and another things is like everyone should have to get the economical support from the government. But the SAR, the COVID emergency response benefit that the government put it right now, it failed to recognize the universality. So looks like that we are totally excluded a group of people to get this kind of benefit. First things is like $5,000 income for 2019. $5,000 income from 2019. A lot of people are unable to do this because they are doing on-call precarious job. Some people give birth, some of them lost the job. So sometimes they are out of the market for study and other things. They cannot meet this criteria. And other things also, like we find it out, lots of women are working as a independent contractor, and that sometimes is very hard to prove that they have $5,000 income. So like these are the issue, they excluded the women. Second exclusion is coming when they said that you have to lost a job due to the COVID related things. We find it out that because of the after December, a lot of people are not rehired by this precarious sector job. So they are waiting for the economy blooming and they are going to hire. And if you see the report about the job loss, 90% job lost from this frontline sector, retail sector, manufacturing sector. And who are the people are working on this sector? These are these NSRI people. I have a woman, I just want to say this story, that she is a student. She came in Canada to study with 3 months pregnancy, and right now she cannot continue her study because of her critical pregnancy situation. She lost her studentship. Right now she is an undocumented woman and do not have any support, financial support, to continue her pregnancy and to get some doctor's help or something, or any kind of financial help. I tried to dig up the system, and I find it out that there is huge amount of systemic barrier. There is no support for this woman. Like total support is zero. There is another woman who got affected in the workplace and unable to, like when the workplace has this COVID-19 and she was so scared and she don't want to go to work. The employer called her and said, if you are not coming to work, if you are voluntarily leave the job, you are not eligible for EI, you are not eligible for CERB. So government give the authority for the employer to the employer, that employer will going to be identify who should get this benefit. So like this kind of barrier, like authorize the employer by the government, is totally underestimate the vulnerability of these women. So this systemic barrier is not right now for the COVID-19. It is an existing systemic barrier. And now, because of the COVID-19, it's revealed. It shows that inequality of the society. It shows that our fabric is no good. I agree with Deepa said that these women are the bottom of the bottom. So bottom of the labor market, where there is no labor right exist and no, they are inhuman condition. So like two kinds of violence that are affected. One is the house, another in the workplace. Both sector women are beaten hardly, and obviously the workplace, when the women working in the precarious job and died in the workplace, why not it is identified as a gender-based violence? It is also gender-based violence. And these kind of job, all this frontline job, this is the job that they cannot do in the home. They have to go physically. All job are 90% occupied by the women. So definitely this pandemic hit very hardly to the women, especially the racialized women, especially the women with undocumented, and especially the women, those who are under poverty before. And we find it out that housing issue is affecting them very critically right now, because it's very hard for keeping social distance when they live a lot of people together in a house. So these are the things also on the top of these things, because when the poverty is in here, a lot of people are not complying their health issue before. So like physically, these most of these women, you'll find it out that they have an underlying health condition. So these make them more vulnerable. And on the top of this mental pressure, I feel it like we are in a very broken situation right now. Society is very broken. We need immediate recognition by the government system that where the support and resource should has to be go, support them too. Because it is not like, okay, if these women should has to be forgettable. If they are getting affected by the COVID-19, society will going to be affected. Like this crack, the women fall through this service crack. COVID-19 virus also fall through by the service crack and attack these women. So that is our concern. Like if they are not survive, we are not survive. So together, how we can survive, that will be our main requirement, that how we can survive together. And our assessment is, rather than other group of people, these women are affected. So we need to use this feminist gender lens that government always said, we're going to use this gender lens to our all services. Where is this gender lens? Is this gender lens? Don't find it out that inequality in here, in this society, that create more vulnerability for this group of people to survive in Canadian society.
Right. Thank you, Sultana.
You're welcome.
Thank you, because also what you're really emphasizing is kind of what ends up being a limited kind of view of what we understand or conceive of gender-based violence. So you're really stressing an important point there. And you're sharing also these other pieces, the systemic barriers you're sharing, that we're hearing being echoed from all of the speakers right now, which is really important. And the character of these forms of violence, as you say, that it's not just in the home, or that they're manifested as well when we think about the types of precarious work. And so thinking about this isolation and also the social distancing that was here already before this crisis or this pandemic. I want to come back now to our speakers. I think in many ways, lots of you have already responded to the question that followed, which is more about what's required of our work right now, of our actions, and our community kind of responses. You've touched on this. I know I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to offer everyone another minute, please, if you'd like to just kind of speak to that. What was that? Our second question, thinking a little bit more about what's required of our work and our actions. Let's go back to, if we can go back to Deepa, that would be great. Deepa, are you still on the call?
Sorry, I'm still on the call. I muted myself, so
Sure.
I hope you can hear me now. Yeah.
Great, excellent.
So yeah, sure. In terms of the actions and the work that is required, as I said before, right, like that, the coordination and obviously us connecting with each other to make sure that the resources that one person gets to can take, everyone else can take advantage of. That knowledge sharing is really important, and that coordination of the advocacy efforts is really important. I know that Cornelia will be speaking about the rights of non-status women networks advocacy. I have also been working with Advocacy Caucus to talk about the advocacy that we are trying to do with Ministry of Attorney General around the carding and the policing issues, making sure that we are all asking for the same thing from various different vehicles of advocacy that we use and coordinate our efforts to build the pressure and ask for the same thing, which is what Sultana said, that if the things are already so bad, and if you're going to do certain things for COVID-19, can some of those things which are positive, so for example, the health change that we saw, can that stay? And can you actually put your your money where your mouth is and actually give us a real GBV analysis. In terms of the service provision, I would really, really, really emphasize on the point that there are GBV expertise in the sector. Like, take advantage of the clinic. I welcome all of you to connect with us and think about, we have resources around how do you do this work safely with women. We have resources of making sure that women who are isolated are given phones and tablets, and we are developing that expertise to connect and make sure that we are all on the same page and we can actually utilize those resources. There is a one chance rule. If a woman gets in touch with you at this point who is non-status or immigrant, please do not lose that one chance if you get it.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you so much, Deepa. Really excellent points of coordinating our advocacy efforts. And like you said, there's groups that have been doing this work for a long time, who have tools, who have insight, and that's definitely, we should be making that work visible right now and consulting with those groups as well, as you mentioned. I want to bring Mercy back to the conversation as well, just because I'm conscious of time. Just a minute to kind of offer your opinion here around what's required of our work at this time.
Okay, I'll take less than a minute because everybody, I think Deepa has said it all, that I totally agree with everything that has been said. I think that there is strength in numbers. There's a lot of expertise out there, and it's for us to come together, you know, that coordination, advocacy, making sure that we're on the same page. Just like, you know, Deepa just said, these are so important. Again, there's strength in numbers, and there's a lot of expertise. There are lots of services out there, and we just need to just push forward. Yeah. In the interest of time, I don't want to repeat myself, so I'll just end it.
That's great. Thank you, Mercy. Thanks for emphasizing that point. Definitely. I'm going to go now to Cornelia. If you want to just provide your opinion, conscious of time. Did we lose you, Cornelia? Are you there?
I'm here.
Great.
Yes, I definitely agree. Coordination and advocacy, it needs to be uniform. However, that's a standard that we are working towards. In my experience, since the virus, there has been a lot of work done by individual organizations trying to reach out to their own particular memberships. So the focus was more on fight or flight, pretty much, deal with emergency after emergency. That's not to say that coordination and advocacy doesn't have to be uniform, but we also have to be aware of burnout for our organization members. So that's one, because if you get burned out, you're not going to be able to assist in a meaningful way. In my community, for example, Black Creek Community Farm, they've been providing food boxes for people who are isolated at home, and they created a WhatsApp chat just to deal with that specific situation. So I know that there are a lot of organizers who work small scale in WhatsApp groups trying to organize and respond to emergencies. But yes, definitely coordination and advocacy, citywide, provincial, and federal, it's crucial.
Excellent. Yes, and thank you for that reminder also of taking care of ourselves, the groups and the people that are doing this work as well. I think that's really an important point that you're emphasizing.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Cornelia. And I welcome our participants, people, attendees who are on the call as well. There's going to be a poll that's circulating. You'll be able to access that if you look in your control panel where it says polls. You'll be able to also participate and answer that question that we're asking our speakers in terms of what's required of our work, our actions. And I believe the first one will ask you about the group that you're affiliated with. But I want, because we're conscious of time, I still want to give Sultana an option as well to be able to respond to the question around what's required of our work. I know you touched on it when you spoke earlier. Sultana?
Hello?
Hi, Sultana. Yes.
Hey, I'm so sorry. Yeah,
No
I just want to add in here that we need an immediate action because we need universal livelihood support for all right now because the virus will not going to be go within 1 or 2 months. It will stay for a long time, and this pandemic, if we are not taking action as early as possible, we're going to see that our situation will going to be get more severe. So obviously, I agree with all other speakers that we need advocacy things, but we need a strongly go to the government to say that first things we need universal livelihood support for all and a strong health and safety measurement if the people are going in the workplace and the voice from the worker. It's not the employer who going to say, okay, the workplace is safe. No, if the employee feel the workplace is not safe, they can quit or come back because this is their health. So that kind of privilege and authority, the employee, the working women, and everybody need it, and everyone should have to need the livelihood support, regardless the status. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sultana. Thank you to all of our speakers who just participated in this and providing us very much a look at the systemic side of the challenges and also providing us with practical ways and of the way that we could be organizing and coordinating our advocacy efforts right now. Next, I'm going to make sure that I'm sharing my screen here. I'm going to share with the next part of our session is focused more on thinking about other regions across Canada. As we mentioned earlier at the start of this roundtable, we're a group of community partners and organizational leaders, representatives from organizations across different regions in Canada. So today what we're doing is we're also asking them to participate and share a little bit about what their assessment is about what's happening across the regions. In particular, in this part of the session, we're speaking to frontline workers, managers of different programs and services provisions around gender-based violence. So one moment here, just want to make sure that my screen is here. Just need to close our poll and I'll be able to share the screen. So to start thinking about the other regions, we're going to start first with Jeanette, who joins us from the New Brunswick Multicultural Council. The question here is, Jeanette, what is your assessment on the impact of COVID-19 when we're thinking about gender-based violence against non-status refugee and immigrant women? And what are some of the gaps and challenges that you have encountered as a service provider? So Jeanette, I think that my only request will be if you could unmute because I don't think I have that option.
I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Okay, great. Yes, we can hear you. Hi, Jeanette.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much to the speakers for presenting such a thorough analysis of what's happening across the country. I don't have a whole lot to add in terms of the assessment on the causes of violence, on what we're seeing in our province. It's much of the same picture. Access to services is clearly limited in our province as well. But I'd like to add a little bit more information about what's happening in New Brunswick, specifically in smaller and rural communities. Deepa mentioned, there are some differences between larger urban centers and rural communities and how we're able to provide supports or
Oh, it seems like we lost Jeanette. One moment. These are these technical pieces here. Jeanette, are you still on the call? All right, we're gonna have to see if she is able to reconnect. In the meantime, I am gonna move forward to our next speaker. Just gonna make sure that Jeanette is. So Tao, are you on the line there? Tao is joining us from Ottawa, from the Immigrant Women's Services of Ottawa.
Hi, I'm on the line now.
We'll start with you again. Sorry, just because we lost Jeanette there, we'll start with you if you want to share kind of what's been happening in Ottawa and that region. And maybe we can also think about the second question, some of the tools or strategies and resources that have been useful with supporting survivors of gender-based violence, victims of gender-based violence in Ottawa?
So I will cover the two questions at the same time, so we don't have to go back and forth. Yeah.
Thanks,
So,
Tal. Yeah, sure.
and also, I'd like to thank all the previous speakers. It's very true and emotional what they have, take us on that journey. And to add to that, I would just like, as for Ottawa, we are in strict lockdown. So accessing to services is extremely difficult for most of the majority of the people, but it is much more difficult for non-status refugees and immigrant women, especially when they don't speak the language, either the official language, English or French. And then they have faced another issues of limited resources, such as phones, computer, and laptops. I think that's the issues that most of our clients are facing. So if I could take you back a little bit, continue on what Mercy had give you pictures of what a non-status woman, and then I would further a bit more to say that some of the cases that come to us as a non-status woman, they come to our agency. Most of them come to Canada and marry a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, but they've never been sponsored by their spouse, and they remain as a visitor status. And they're facing violence and abuse. And then during the COVID-19 crisis, and with social distancing, it can put the women into much even higher risk because they're living in a tighter quarter with their abuser, further limiting their ability to reach out for support and for help. They are in absolute isolation with the abuser, more tension, more stress, and even much more dangerous situation during this pandemic period. And still, they are without status. So, and the gap and the challenges we face as service provider, as I mentioned earlier, that the limited resources that not only faced by our clients, but also by ourselves as workers, as service providers, for lack of technology device. But luckily, our organization is able to sorting it out at the moment. So I'm very thankful for that. Mm-hmm. Just to mention that, most of us are mothers right now. And our children are home with us from school. So besides doing our job from home, providing the service that really crucially needed, we are also the caregiver, the teacher. There's just many hats that we're wearing right now. And the stress that you could imagine that is inevitable for most of the workers as well. So I could imagine that we go through that much of stress, and the stress that the non-status women are going through, and the barriers that they face at the same time is probably beyond words could ever described. Mm-hmm. Another challenge that I'm thinking that we reaching out to the vulnerable population, which is the non-status women. But the most of the status clientele often do not have access to the technology device that we talked about. And so they are often unable to reach out for community for support, especially when they have not established community connection. And those are some of the challenges that I see that we are facing. Mm-hmm. For the second part of the effective tools and strategies and resources that we find useful to supporting our clients. Mm-hmm. Tools, I'm talking about very hands-on tools. Luckily, right now, we have different apps that we could use, like WhatsApp, Viber, Zoom, Google Hangout, to communicate and to deliver information session and activities effectively to our clients. The strategy that we use is to support our clients during this COVID-19, that we try to bring clients out of isolation, give them a sense of accomplishment, build a network and a sense of belonging, mm-hmm. by providing different activities, workshops online. At Immigrant Women's Services Ottawa, we have many of the activities and workshops, such as we have the English conversation class every day since the lockdown on March 17. We started right away with the class online, At the beginning, our number was, the participant were about 12 to 13, but up to now it has been increasing. I just checked with my colleague and we have 20 participants today. So just to mention those, a few things that to keep the women connected. We have other activities such as computer class, for example, the 6 weeks program, and the participant will get a certificate upon the completion of each level. And this will give them a sense of accomplishment. Other activities that we have online, such as art class, yoga class, citizenship class, others give them a sense of belonging, mental health, and community connection with other women in the same or a similar situation that they're in. We just started a new program. It's called for the Care for Newcomer Children. So we started a program for children such as doing storytelling, simple art and craft exercise to keep the children busy, active, learning, and then most importantly, to give their mom a break. So these are some of the things that I like to share. That's what's going on our end of the wood. Thank you.
Thank you, Tao. Thank you so much, Tao. And you were mentioning that piece around the digital divide, right, in terms of even access. And I see what you're mentioning as well about some of the ways that you're adapting these programs. I know when we had the opportunity to go to the Immigrant Women's Services of Ottawa, how important those English classes were, those conversational classes, and also sewing classes. That was a part of breaking isolation that I know you're emphasizing right now. So thank you for sharing.
And Margarita, I'd just like to share one thing that resonates with me this morning from reading the paper.
Please do.
So there was a quote, and it say, "This pandemic has made refugees of us all." So it just resonated with me. It just reminded us, at a time like this, we are all pretty much the same. And the pandemic is pretty much testing our humanity. So we need to tell ourselves that we can get through this, and it's just a temporary situation, and we need to be patient, to be calm, to live it day by day, but most importantly, to be kind to ourselves and to each other. So, my 2 cents.
Thank you, Tao. I know you do bring us back to thinking also about our self-care and our boundaries as well in this work as well. So thank you, Tao, for that as well. Next, I'm going to just check in to see if Jeanette is still on the call.
Yes, I am. Sorry, my audio
no
disconnected. And I don't know at what point it disconnected because I continued to chat and then I realized that it had disconnected.
Okay, no problem. Yes, there's been some technical issues, but all good. I'm glad you're back. Did you want to respond then to the questions that were around more? I think you were mentioning you were kind of going towards talking about effective tools and strategies, resources, kind of what you're seeing there in Fredericton.
Right. So I don't know if you heard the part about the temporary foreign worker ban in New Brunswick. So I was explaining a little bit around that and some of the challenges that I'm sorry, I don't want to repeat if you already heard. So did you hear the part where I said that the government banned temporary foreign workers in the province?
We lost you really early on, so it's okay if you want to start. No problem.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. I'm so sorry about that.
No
yes. So I guess, so you may have, right. So I'll start a little bit from the beginning. So yes, there are some added advantages and challenges of operating in rural communities. So as I mentioned, the added ability to connect individually with some of the clients and the newcomers that we know in our community and able to support them with the resources that we need. But some of the challenges that we see in our provinces is really through the disconnect of our services and our government services. Our social assistance at this point is really overwhelmed. The pace of response is really limited. Same in our mental health and healthcare facilities. And the added challenge in rural communities is also the access to transportation and access to safe spaces to get outside and to access those services, even if you can leave. And so without any public transportation, people in rural communities can't even necessarily access basic services like healthcare or even a friend when there's no public transportation in many of these communities that could be, an hour away from from hospitals or from shelters. So that is something that we're facing in New Brunswick across the communities. I won't necessarily repeat everything because I know we're tight on time, but one other kind of unique situation that we're seeing in New Brunswick, and that was announced just this week, is that our government banned temporary foreign workers from entering the province for this upcoming season. And in addition to that, the government is also looking at quote unquote kind of repurposing workers that are already in the province where the jobs are needed. And there's some considerable kind of moral and ethics question about, you know, to what extent these people have, these individuals have agency in the decision and where they're being sent and under what conditions, especially where many individuals have built relationships with the communities or the employers with whom they work. And so we're still trying to navigate that and the impacts that that's going to have, the added pressures, and the also, you know, the racist the race implications of this, because we have seen a lot of racist attacks against temporary foreign workers or any kind of foreign nationals in our province. A lot of blame and a lot of fear that these are the people who may bring COVID-19 to our province. And so we're trying to really stifle that kind of language and really look at in supporting the narrative that immigrants and newcomers and temporary workers have a really important role to play in the economic and social development of our province. So we're trying to navigate that narrative and understand what kind of provincial supports are going to exist for and continue on for non-permanent residents in our province. So I'll leave it at that for now.
All right, thank you, Jeanette. And thank you, because you're bringing up some really important points. That earlier, one of the speakers also mentioned the need for us to have an understanding of what's happening in different regions. In this case, you're also referring to some of those more remote communities. So I'm really grateful that you're able to provide some insight around that. Next, I want to see if if Yasmin from the Barbara Schleifer Commemorative Clinic is on the call, to ask her if she can maybe offer some of her experience here with the gaps and challenges that she's encountering in service provision, and also she could speak to some of the effective tools or strategies, some of the resources that have been kind of useful in the ways that maybe as a staff lawyer she's been redistributing her kind of focus or her time and working with others at the Barbara Schleifer Clinic. So Yasmin, are you on the call?
Yes, hi. How are you guys doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. Yeah.
All right. I wanted to thank you guys for inviting me on this panel, and I want to thank the previous speakers for their eloquent articulation of, you know, the challenges and the risks that NSRI women are facing systemically and, you know, at the local level. So I don't want to reiterate too much of what was previously said. I had a lot of those same points written out as talking points, but I do want to give you, you know, from a legal perspective, as a lawyer working with NSRI women fleeing gender-based violence, our clients, you know, number one concern generally when they come to us initially is finding a way to regularize their status. And most of the immigration clients that we work with at the clinic are non-status women. So in my assessment anyways, there's two major concerns that have arisen from the COVID-19 pandemic crisis with regards to our non-status clients. And the first is obviously the economic impact that it's had on them and their families. So, you know, for our non-status clients, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a catastrophic impact on their lives. Since they do work, you know, mostly cash-based jobs, there's no job security. They've faced the same layoffs as the other workers, but without any of access to the safety nets that have been provided to the Canadian workers at large. So unless, you know, the client has been working with a valid work permit or has an active SIN number, she can't really access any of the federal Canada Emergency Response benefit options. And so when they come to us without having any income available to them, you know, federally, and when they don't qualify for the federal benefits, often the provincial social assistance is the only other option that we can pursue for the client. Now, to access these provincial social assistance, at least in Ontario, clients are being asked to show proof of immigration status, or at least proof that of the submission of a permanent residence application. And without this documentation, our clients are actively being denied access to that provincial assistance, which brings us to the next big challenge they're facing, which is while we continue to work with our clients on their immigration applications to regularize their status, we've experienced further barriers. Specifically, we need to complete the same immigration forms, the same affidavits as before the COVID-19 pandemic, but our ability to do so and the client's ability to provide the necessary documentation has now been, significantly diminished. So the two common applications that we do regularly at the clinic to assist our non-status clients are applications for permanent residence based on humanitarian and compassionate grounds, which are typically called, H&C applications, and temporary resident permits, which will also include the temporary resident permit for family violence, which was a new, policy initiative by the government that happened last year. Now, the problem with this is IRCC has indicated that they will not be accepting these applications online with e-signatures as they do for other immigration applications. And this is problematic in our experience at the clinic because this puts the clients, at direct risk, since we need to meet with them either to commission documents and collect evidence, or we risk mailing it to them. And, if they continue to live with the abuser, they risk the abuser finding these documents and having being at further risk of violence. Another issue is even if the client doesn't live with the abuser currently, we can't necessarily take advantage of all of the virtual commissioning that you could do with other clients because non-status women don't have access to the technology necessary, such as Zoom, to be able to facilitate that. Another problematic barrier that we've found is that clients, our non-status clients, have now lost their wages, and it's made it extremely difficult for them to pay for the substantial processing fees that accompany these applications. And unfortunately, currently IRCC, which is Immigration, Refugee, Citizenship Canada, will not begin to even process the applications without these fees. So these are just some sort of the practical barriers that we've been facing trying to work with non-status women facing gender-based violence on the ground right now. So we find that our clients are often, they're in a catch-22 situation where they need an immigration application to be able to access provincial aid, but they don't have the money for the immigration application. So yeah, that's just some examples of the barriers we've been seeing. Yes. As far as the second question, what tools and resources we've been able to access, it's best, at least in our experience at the time, to be as creative as possible. And we try to work with our clients to see what tools they have access to. What can we use to get, to communicate with them, whether it's WhatsApp or any other applications that they are able to access. So we try to accommodate as much as possible. As far as other resources, the clinic is assisting with vouchers for clients at the time. I know there's a lot of, VAW women's shelters and organizations doing similar work. And we also are providing consistent counseling check-ins as well with clients to make sure that they are mentally coping with this, pandemic as best they can, and to provide an outlet to them and a means of brief counseling services as well.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, because you're really speaking also, while you're speaking, it's really clear that we're hearing about this digital divide, but we're also hearing about we're already some of these kinds of barriers have only intensified right now, and you're giving us a lot of nuance, a lot of these details around what it looks like for people that are even trying to fill out these applications, like you said, this kind of virtual piece and the electronic signature, etc. So it's really important, all of these details that you're sharing with us. I'm going to ask now if Lubna, who's joining us from Edmonton, who is representing the Islamic Family Social Services Association. Lubna, are you on the call? Would you like to, I know that you had created kind of more of an assessment around what was happening in Edmonton, but I know you can also speak to some of the kind of ways that you are creating effective tools and strategies, resources to support survivors and victims of gender-based violence. Lubna? I can hear something, so I'm just gonna see if I can unmute. A moment. Okay. I think we may have lost Lubna. Okay, go back. All right. Well, we had, while we see if maybe Lubna will connect with us for this question, we also had another poll that was, Lubna?
I am on mute. Oh, good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. Great. Okay. Happy
afternoon.
you're there. Go ahead.
Okay. So I would just like to share a couple of perceptions that we have observed here in Edmonton. A lot of it has been shared by my other colleagues. So just wanted to share what we have seen. So there is a group where we see that they are consistently, they are calling to shelters. Shelters are seeing an increased volume in calls. But then there is another trend where we see, specifically in our own organization, we offer a helpline from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. 7 days a week. And we have noticed that there haven't been any increase in calls and related to any kind of gender-based violence. However, there has been a huge increase in calls for essential needs. So IFSA offers the second largest food bank depot here in Edmonton. And what we have seen is, and we cater to, by the way, 600 families, that's about around 3,000 individuals. And primarily all our clients are non-status, refugee and immigrant communities from African, Arab, and South Asian background. So I do agree that our group definitely, safety is a huge concern for them. They are more in their survival mode. This sort of situation is not new for them because they have seen them back home. Right now for them, it is more important to stay at home and be safe. But then we are also cognizant of the fact that because they are hearing that stay at home and be safe, they may be thinking that they may not be able to come out. Okay, it's better to stay at home. And we are foreseeing that post-pandemic, we will see a huge rise in domestic violence and family violence situations. This is what our sort of perspective is. Now, in terms of the other, so I'm also going to present some perspective from SACE, Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton, because SACE and IFSA kind of work together with Advocacy.
Right.
So here, what they are saying is that they have definitely seen an increase in gender-based violence, including sexual violence in their agency, because of course, you know, violence escalates as external stressors and anxieties increase. And this is particularly true when people are forced into self-isolation with the person who is causing them harm. They have concerns that people that experience the most marginalization prior to the pandemic may be even more isolated and at risk for violence within the home. Alberta's One Line for Sexual Violence has had a 57% increase in calls, texts, and chats since the pandemic began.
Mm-hmm.
So just to kind of move on to the challenges and gaps that definitely we are noticing is, so at IFSA we are able to provide, in normal times we are able to provide face-to-face outreach services. We have groups that we offer, and then also counseling, culturally specific counseling services. Right now what we are doing is we have our office open. Some of the staff are frontline staff. They are offering food bank services, as I mentioned earlier, but also we have one outreach staff available in the office, and they take turns.
Mm-hmm.
Then also our counseling services has been open from day one, providing counseling from using phone or maybe sometimes FaceTime. We have noticed by profession, I'm a registered psychologist, so I'm the resident counselor with the organization as well. What
Mm-hmm.
I is often my clients, they would have to sit in the car or go outside to take my calls for
Okay.
sessions, that just to be safe.
Mm-hmm.
What we have done is there have also been some opportunities where the file is open with the family, with the child and family services. Here we have been able to set up a Zoom call
Mm-hmm.
with the child and family services worker, the client, myself, and then if there is another worker involved, to kind of do a family a session to provide as much support as we can to the family. Actually, we are scheduled to have one at 3 p.m. today. So this is what is happening here at IFSA. One thing that has just come to notice, I was just talking to one of my colleagues that clients, they are assuming that they cannot leave the situation. But then another thing that is happening is when a client leaves, they receive funding from Alberta Social Services, and it's called the FLEA fund, Flea Abuse Fund. However, because so much federal funding has been announced, now Alberta Social Services are not offering that Flea Abuse Fund. So that may be again a hindrance for them to leave the situation where they're often not able to be independent on their own. So these are some of the things that we have noticed here in terms of gaps, as well as, of course, we are not able to provide face-to-face services, all the agencies here in Edmonton that offer domestic violence services are offering services via phone, which I'm sure is similar to other provinces.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lubna. Thank you for providing so much detail and really identifying kind of what are some of the entry points or the ways that you're redistributing the way that you're also doing your work at the Islamic Family Social Services Association. I think that we were going to have another speaker, Perminder Flora from Mosaic from Vancouver. Unfortunately, she sent her regrets and won't be able to participate. But I really just want to say, and I am conscious of time right now, that we do have another poll that Neera will be generating, and so people that are listening right now can participate in that poll. But I really want to thank all of the speakers who have participated today. We've heard from a group that's very much well-versed in thinking about what it means to be isolated, what it means to be socially distanced, and thinking also about how this has been something that was before we arrived at this kind of pandemic. This is something ongoing, separation, exclusion that we're hearing. And I think that we're really hearing also the role of advocacy, and we're hearing also the role of coordination. And so these kinds of conversations are so important, in particular because they're centered around our practices, they're centered around our interactions and building these relationships and building these networks. So we're going to we just have a few minutes. I had our team with Cassie was kind of on the lookout for the chat to see if any questions were asked during this round table. Neera, I'm not sure what you may have been seeing or hearing, or if there were any questions that were there. You're also welcome to add some questions to the chat. One moment, I'm going to Here we have people that are responding to our poll, which we're grateful for. Keep in mind that we're going to be sharing this recording. We're also going to be sharing a visual summary that will act as a way to see these different threads, the different conversations that we're having, and really be able to highlight some of the points that were raised today. And let's see here. Let's see if I can move forward on this. I also really want to, for folks that want to, leave a question, they can do so in the chat room. But I also just want to thank you again for joining us. I'm conscious of time. Thank you for joining us. There's the benefits really of these talks, or the information that we can share across geographical boundaries right now to increase collective knowledge and skills. I heard from the speakers, we heard it echoed, the idea of really a coordinated response, a way of coming together. So we invite people to also join. We have a community of practice on settlenet.org, and we really invite people to join us on that community of practice where people can continue to interact around this subject. It's a place where we will be sharing information and follow-up around what we discussed today. And we also invite you to participate in the feedback survey that will be available once the session closes. Please be on the lookout. We will be sharing an invitation for our upcoming webinar that's focused really on the ways that this virus has weaponized and advanced an agenda of xenophobia and racism in Canada, and in particular anti-Asian racism. So please be on the lookout. We will be sharing that information. We will be sharing as well with all those who have registered with us today. If we have any questions or anything that are coming into the chat,